mai, hoki mai ki a the fold, e mihi nei ko Duncan Greive tōku ingoa. My guest this week is Guy Montgomery, who is a stand-up comic. You've probably heard of him. And he's now the host, showrunner, creator of Guy Mont-Spelling Bee, which is a sort of like a panel show, hour long, very broad, plays at 7:30 p.m. that he sort of came up with during lockdown, has now become a TV show, but also has a lot more legs. So those are the sort of two strands of his current career. But I've sort of known Guy for probably about 10 years. I wrote a feature about The Worst Idea of All Time, the podcast that he did with Tim Batt, where they watched Grown Ups 2 every week for seemingly years. And I've always found him a very sort of original and funny comedian. Not you know, that should be a prereq for being a comic, but as he sort of talks about, sometimes other things can get in the way. But I saw his first show at the Basement, and I just thought he really had something. And so it's been cool to kind of watch his career develop over the years. Him to, you know, as he talks quite candidly in this podcast about him basically being hugely indebted to Rhys Darby's character from Flight of the Conchords, to Murray, in his early years, shall we say, and then just sort of gradually figuring out who he is. And I think, you know, I saw My Mind Is Blowing Me Crazy, his most recent hour at the Rangatira Room at Q Theatre, 450 people, and he was just kind of effortless. He just really knows who he is right now. And I think between that and Spelling Bee, you know, a lot of that hard, doubt-filled, just really just grindy part of being a creator, being a comic, whether or, you know, it's any kind of creative, whether, you know, musician, director, writer, it's really hard to kind of push through those early years unless you're, you know, Lord, and it just happens. Not that it just happens, but, you know, like it comes at you very quickly. For most people, it involves a lot of pushing through that, and to sort of have him be on the other side and reflecting on his path there is what I think we get out of this. So talk about the genesis of Spelling Bee, talk about the Melbourne Comedy Festival, the pivotal role that's played in his development, and then really sort of dig into how Spelling Bee sort of was made and where it might go. It's a really fun chat with a person who I really respect and admire, and who is just really funny. Maybe not so much on this podcast, but in general. So yeah, this is Guy Montgomery on The Fold. Kia ora, Guy. Welcome to The Fold.
Kia ora, Duncan. Welcome to The Fold.
Oh no, it's going to be like that.
No, it's going to be good.
Hey, so congratulations on your show. My Mind Is Blowing Me Crazy.
Yes, thank you.
Two things stood out about it for me. What the first is kind of fairly prosaic, and that it just glided along. Like you know these jokes, and you can kind of inhabit them, which felt like a real treat. The second was, like, I feel like I've watched you, and particularly your generation, do a lot of very kind of high concept shows over the last sort of decade or so. So it was almost jarring to see someone come out with just like jeans, t-shirts, some jokes, and a spotlight, and just be comfortable with that. Like, well, what's going on there?
So that's called stand-up comedy, Duncan, and it's an exciting new medium.
Okay.
But I mean, I actually remember you came to the first solo show I did, which was called Guy Montgomery Presents a Succinct and Concise Summary of How He Feels About Certain Things. And I don't know that we knew each other. You sent me a DM on Twitter that was complimentary, and I was very grateful. And that was just stand-up. And in the intervening years, so this would be my 8th solo show I've just done. But I sort of went off track a little bit to play around and see what else I could do. A lot of that was inspired by watching Sam Campbell in Australia, who's a fantastic Australian comic. He's won the Melbourne Comedy Award, the Edinburgh Comedy Award, and he's on the new, just announced on the 16th season of Taskmaster. But he's he's sort of, he's a generational talent. And so he's sort of, I think his influence reached after a bunch of us first went over to the Melbourne Comedy Festival. A lot of people were like, oh, wow, it can be anything. And so I came back and played around with that a little bit. And then the longer I've been going, the more I've been like, other people there's a lot more incorporation of multimedia and sort of character elements and other things. And the draw or the pull for me has just been back to doing stand-up. I love the setup. I love that I could walk out of this room and onto the stage and just do my job and walk off. Like, I like that you can show up to work with just a phone and your wallet and keys in your pockets and take them out, and then you can do it. I don't have to clean anything up after the show. And it's something I've worked really hard to get really good at, and I like that I'm really good at it, and I like being able to share that and to show people that.
Yeah, there was this kind of confidence, I guess, about it both just presentationally and just the whole show. Like you sort of know who you are as a comic at this point in your career.
There's definitely that just comes with time. I think that's true of any creative pursuit where you do settle into your voice, and naturally when you start, there's I can't even remember who wrote it. There's a Phaidon, that it's Phaidon. They publish nice books,
big fancy, but
and there's some little ones too, some little fancy books. And there's one called Steal Like an Artist, and I sort of read it after I'd started doing it. But basically, it's like when you're starting, you're just pulling from every single influence and resource you can to try and forge your own voice through it. So when I first started, I was in Canada. And I was this was not long after Concords had blown up, and I was writing my own jokes, which weren't very good, but I was performing them essentially as Rhys Darby, which delivered a certain confidence or persuasiveness to the audience that sort of tricked them into being like, oh yeah, this guy sort of has something. And especially because I was a New Zealander in Canada,
that's the only cultural reference point apart from Lord of the Rings.
That's right. At the time, it was right in the zeitgeist. So, they probably just thought this is how New Zealanders are. And so, but through the years, I've stolen from like Peter Cook and Norm Macdonald, and sort of, it's not a hugely disparate resource pool. It's just basically fellas I find funny. And through all of that, with time, has emerged, I think, a stronger sense of self on stage. I wouldn't be able to describe it in a sentence, but I think I can just sort of, my goal has always been to be able to say a sentence with nothing funny in it and make people laugh.
I think you achieved that.
Thank you.
A few times. Were you conscious of, because that Rhys Darby thing, like I never watched Concords still to this day. Yeah, I mean, or I did, but I basically took an instinctive dislike to the Rhys Darby character. Sorry if you somehow have the misfortune of listening to this, Rhys. It's not personal. It's just the character grated on me. Were you aware that you were doing that? Like,
to an extent, yes. I mean, it's not just the voice in terms of your comedic identity that I was finding. It's also the physical voice with which I would speak on stage. That has taken a long time to even really get closer to my actual speaking voice. And I'm not in total control of that. Like it would modulate. If I was nervous, it would modulate,
It would get racier.
Yeah. And with time, it's sort of flattened out and become more of my own voice. But also, and then there's things like, Norm Macdonald has a very folksy sort of rhythm, and there's a few words. He obviously knows how to pronounce all the words, but sort of just, mispronounces a few words. And so, like, taking parts of that and sort of Frankensteining my own version of, like, the more you overlay all these influences, the more your own voice will emerge. So long as you are working hard and keep pushing forwards, your voice will emerge through it all. And so, I mean, it's gratifying to hear you be like, oh, it feels like you've got a sense of comic identity, because I feel like I do, and I feel like I've worked for it.
Well, and I also think people now know exactly what they're going to get when they go to a Guy Mont show, and there's like a lot of them now. I mean, you were selling out Rangatira, which is a big room, like 450 odd people, and I mean, just in terms of the technical elements of it, like, how does that work? Like, do you book that and just hope, or do you have some kind of data that tells you're good to go with that? Like, is there a science there?
There's a little bit of everything, but mostly I have a fantastic manager now who's an Australian woman named Beck, and she sort of is very good at pushing her clients, in this case me, and sort of being like, I think this is what we're capable of. If you're, I have confidence that we can do this if you want to pursue it. And nearly always I'll say yes. So it's you're trying to grow all the time and grow your audience. And it does feel now, it's interesting in New Zealand, it's been a bit stop-starty because of, there was a pandemic the last couple of years.
So.
And there was like no festival last year, but there was a festival the year before, but there was no festival the year before that. And so to get a through line of audience growth has been challenging.
And even with the festival the year before, you wouldn't have had international. So
No.
like it's been a while since we had a normal one.
And so it's, and also, I mean, there's a massive, like, going out to watch a show is a luxury right now in New Zealand. And so that sort of is a challenge, but that's all ancillary to the question you asked, which is like, is there a science behind it? To an extent, there is. You probably will try and book yourself into a room that feels like it might be a little bit too big. In this case, I've done Rangatira before, but I hadn't done 4 nights. And so that was the new challenge, and it worked.
So congratulations on that, and it was kind of capped off this like quite a great run of shows for you, I think.
Yeah.
Between Melbourne, Sydney, Adelaide. Let's talk about Beck, because it does feel like having good management that sort of gets you and can plan for you can be quite transformative for any kind of any of the solo creative pursuits, I guess.
Well, she occupies an unusual space across Australia, maybe less so because everything's a little bit, it's bigger, they're a little bit more advanced over there. But, she's filling a need, I think, for New Zealand stand-up comedians specifically who's like want to look at live performance as a bread and butter or primary source of income and their most strident creative pursuit. There's Notorious Comedy Management, which is a guy called Richard Carrington, which has been around in New Zealand for a long time, and he represents a lot of the generation above my comics. But in terms of like looking at Australia and New Zealand as one market or place that you can develop and grow an audience, and also somewhat, I mean, I can't reflect on working with other managers who I haven't worked with, but in terms of like the relationship between her and me is like, she's just so good, and I also, to my credit, have become so good as a comedian. And so when we work in tandem, we are both so good. And that, it makes almost, I don't know if it creates something greater than the sum of its parts, but it means that there's no one has had the vision to sort of, or just the confidence maybe to encourage me and some of our other clients to do what she's telling us we can do and helping us do. And she, she does. Ursula Carlson was her first big client, and Ursula Carlson, I don't know if you've had her on the podcast, but she's as a stand-up comedian in New Zealand, she's like the dream business model. Like, she is a monster, and if you look to someone like that and you think, wow, that's feasible. I don't think I'll ever get to that scale, but it's like I can subsist entirely just from doing stand-up comedy and then pick and choose the other parts of the career that I want.
So because I think people in New Zealand, Ursula she's obviously very prominent. She's got a Netflix special, all the rest of it, but I mean, it almost feels like she's bigger in Australia than she is in New Zealand.
Well, yeah, because you can be. Like, she'll go in Australia, she'll tour, she'll perform basically the biggest room in any major centre in Australia every year.
It just doesn't feel like it's particularly well understood here that she has just owned that. And I guess that creates this sort of path that you can sort of study the steps. Like, how much are you a student of the sort of comedy game and observe the way that other people kind of construct their careers, I suppose?
I think if you've been doing it long enough, inevitably you know, like it's not the reason why anyone starts, but once you've been going and you're like, how do I make this sustainable? How do I support a family doing this or whatever? you do start to look to other comedians, and they don't even need to be creative inspirations or like, perfectly simpatico in terms of comedic style, but just like how do you build a sustainable career out of this? And you do wind up sort of like, like I say, she is I would say the standard bearer for what you could achieve in this part of the world by doing stand up. I think at the same time, you look at other comedians who maybe you think are the fun, like it's a funny thing as an industry. There'll be people you're friends with or comics you think are the funniest comedians in the world, and they stagnate, or like their career doesn't get turbocharged the way that you think it should, or some of them probably feel is due. And it's not a total meritocracy. Like it's not always fair, but some of those, it is also. The longer you're around, the more that you, beyond the comedy and making friends and trying to be funny, the more you do notice like the grisly bits of the industry, or like if you're chopping it open and looking at the nerve center of how it all functions. And I don't really have a deep understanding of that. I have, as it relates to me, a cursory enough of an understanding to know what I want to do and how it works. I mean, for me, my goal was always to be fun. Like, it's obviously beyond being funny, the goal is to be able to sustain yourself from doing stand-up comedy. But across all the facets of my career, the dream has always been, and this is what makes working with Beck such a delight, and having management that pushes you and takes care of so much of the grinding administrative parts, which is not why anyone gets into the industry, and especially in New Zealand, is just a forced fact of working inside of comedy. I've just wanted to show up and be funny the whole time. And so the closer I get to that creative ideal, the more I feel like it frees you to actually be able to reach for new heights creatively.
So, and how much of, because one of the things that, we've talked about is the extent to which, appearing on certain shows can have is almost like the biggest single driver of being able to kind of move up a level, move up a venue size, and kind of change your relationship to particularly sort of the away crowd, if you will. Like, how do you first get on those bills, and what is it that gets you kind of into that rotation, gets you sticky?
So you're talking about television shows, sort of, and So in New Zealand, the at least watching comedians before I did it, the most obvious show that would blood new stars was 7 Days, and like you could see the correlation between appearing or being funny on 7 Days. Before that was the Comedy Gala, and your ability to sell tickets in rural or regional New Zealand. And 7 Days still holds this sort of hallowed space, I think, especially for up and coming comedians. But to do it is like you're welcomed into this, this institution essentially that a lot of us grew up watching, and even now, the generation, like I'd say, there's probably two younger generations of comics who are coming through as the next wave of pros, and even the second, so two generations down are getting on it, and you can see it still means something to them, even though, and it's still a great show, but even though I think it's the cultural value, or in terms of the real life audience value, has been diluted significantly just because people watch TV differently. In Australia, I started doing Have You Been Paying Attention? Is a New Zealand version of that, which doesn't quite have the same cachet. But in Australia, this is started by Working Dog, who are the production company who did The Castle. They did Thank God You're Here. They did The Dish. They're responsible for a lot of very influential Australian comedy, TV, and film. So they started Have You Been Paying Attention, and that, because what's Australia's population, do you reckon? 40 million?
20?
20? 25, surely. I'd say 27.
Would you go 27?
I reckon 27. What do you? I'll say 27.
I think I'm going to go 22.
22?
Yeah, I think it might be around 27 combined. I hear?
25. You went 22.
I'm going to hand that to you.
Yeah. But we did well between us. We were really drilling into it.
Yeah, well, your 40 was a bit off.
That was crazy. But I just say something to get the conversation rolling. So there's enough people there who are still watching terrestrial television the way that it was designed. And Have You Been Paying Attention is, I haven't really experienced anything like that until I'd done it. But it appears to be I don't know if it's population density or what, but it has a hold on Australian comedy fans and live comedy goers. That means I went to Adelaide for the first time in my life this year. And, I was performing, I was only in a 90-seat room, but it was full.
But
And
nice, I mean, that, to go to a city that you've literally never set foot in and be able to sell
Exactly.
how many nights?
5 nights, 6 nights.
So, you're talking about over 500 people.
Yeah, that's right. And so, and a lot of, and my audience traditionally looked like me. And it's Chris Parker described my audience as guys who look like me and their girlfriends. And they were certainly peppered through the audience, but also I could see a lot of silver tops, I'd call them. Your boomers, your traditional television watching audience were coming out to the show. And I can only assume that they didn't find me because of my dumb podcast or because I post things on social media. Like, they found me the traditional
route. That is a linear
route.
television audience.
And, that you can feel like it's crazy now to go to Australia and walk out on stage at lineup shows or to your own show and feel like you're not introducing yourself to these people. These people know who they've come to see. And there is a difference, I think, with that television audience who are just coming because they've seen you make jokes on a topical panel show, and then they're being introduced to you as a stand-up. And, not all of those people are going to stick around or come to the next show because they're like, oh, I thought it would be like this. It's like that. That's not for me. But that's actually great. You almost don't want to compromise your comedic voice in any way for the people you've hoovered up along the way, because then you lose your way a little bit. You want to be leading them rather than vice versa. You want like, 40% of those people to go, I actually didn't like that, and piss off because, if they don't like what you want to do, that's fine. That's up to them.
Yeah, you did Adelaide, you did Sydney, but the heart of Australian comedy, where it feels like it has almost like the scale of comedy's relationship to Melbourne is just different to it's almost hard to imagine if you haven't been there, to the extent to which it just sort of soaks the city.
Yeah, that festival, the Melbourne Comedy Festival, is like, it's baked into the Melbourne Australian almost cultural calendar. And so it's the difference with New Zealand, I think, where in New Zealand there'll be huge, like if you could go into the central city during the New Zealand International Comedy Festival and still not know that there's a comedy festival happening. In Melbourne, that is, I would say, impossible to travel into the epicenter of where the festival's happening and not know that it's going on. And people are traveling to Melbourne from around Australia to go to it. They're packing out, a week's worth of shows. They plan a yearly trip to Melbourne around this festival. It is, I think it's the three biggest comedy festivals in the world are the Edinburgh Fringe, which is obviously open access, but also becoming exorbitant, like impossibly expensive, especially, well, for everyone, but especially from New Zealand. It no longer feels like a necessarily sensible or logical choice to go over and try it. Just for Laughs in Montreal, which is like a legacy brand name festival that is invitation only. And then the Melbourne Comedy Festival, which is like the scale of anything, and the best comedians from all around the world will come and do their shows there as well. And so you're competing in a market and performing alongside and meeting with these people. And Melbourne's got a population of 5 million people. It's the same size as New Zealand. So it's like, it's amazing.
And it's a very cultured city to begin with. So it's like if the whole population of New Zealand was like Wellingtonians.
Exactly. And the infrastructure of the city means that everything funnels into the middle. And so people are like, it's not a logistical nightmare to be like, I would like to go to a show tonight. You could, like in Auckland, it's very difficult to impulsively decide to go and watch a show in the central city one night, because you have to account for parking or Ubering from wherever you are, and like all these very unbecoming and inconvenient hurdles or obstacles. In Melbourne, like someone could be like, I'm going to this tonight, and it's a lot easier to say yes along the way to wind up at that show.
So do you want to just go into a bit more detail about how it's different? Like, for example, in New Zealand, you typically play 4 or 5 nights, right? Whereas Melbourne, it's much longer runs.
Yeah.
And you can kind of build an audience, or word of mouth has a much greater power.
Yeah. It's sort of, I don't know how to describe it. It's not an impossible problem to solve for New Zealand, but the difference in Melbourne is because of the length of the festival and the density of population, word of mouth actually functions as a marketing tool in a way that there is not enough run up in New Zealand for it to work. So you do 22 shows. You go over there. I can't remember. You go over whenever and you do shows. Monday's off, basically. So Tuesday through Saturday, you do the show at, say, 8 o'clock. And then Sundays, all the shows move an hour earlier. So you do the same show at an hour before whatever made up time I just said. And then on Monday, you wouldn't do anything. And there'll be shows that are on a Monday. But and so you are, I mean, first of all, the audience has an opportunity to grow, and people who come and enjoy the show have the chance to tell people, and they can plan however far out to come and see you. Also, the show gets to grow so much, and you get to grow so much as a performer. Like, you become so sharp, and like, you're constantly, even if you're not actively sitting down and listening to the show and like rewriting certain jokes, just by repeating it, the muscle memory and the practice of saying it over and over again, you're refining everything. You're like, there's not a laugh here, there's a lag here, and so you just pull that chunk out or whatever, and you know, a new joke will blossom in its place. It's just in terms of, you know, both creatively and audience wise, the opportunity for growth and the way that it functions is just, the scale is just, it's completely different. It's you know, and you go to Sydney Comedy Festival afterwards, and that's so much more like the New Zealand Comedy Festival. It's like a lot of people in Sydney don't know it's happening. It's like you're in Sydney at the same time as some of your friends who are also doing comedy shows. And what happens in Melbourne is very unique and sort of indigenous to Melbourne in terms of the way that comedy festivals function around this part of the world. So,
I mean, along with your show, you also did a live version of Spelling Bee, which has become... I mean, I'd really like to kind of drill into that, because it feels like, you know, you've got this track with your career doing stand-up that's working out very well for you. And then there's this new thing over here which really doesn't have a defined ceiling. Could be a quirky little couple of seasons, or it could be something a lot more than that. First off, just tell me about the genesis of the show.
Yeah. So it was during the lockdown, the first lockdown from the aforementioned pandemic. And obviously all of the comedy festivals had been wiped out. I just moved home to New Zealand from New York, not knowing that we were going to be inside for a year. And so it was quite, you know, the lifestyle change for everyone, but also, you know, measured up against what I was imagining for the year was quite dramatically different. And I was sort of trying to think of a way to entertain myself. People were doing a lot of online pub quizzes, which almost satisfied, you know, both the social and comedic need. Like, you know, it was there was a period, I don't know if you remember, where having a beer with your friends on Friday on Zoom was almost fulfilling.
Yeah, I haven't actually thought about that since then, and it's kind of giving me quite a queasy feeling, the extent to which I was excited about that.
That's right.
You know, obviously terrible experience.
Two of my best friends, Ken and Joe, we had a thread. It was essentially like a mental health service we were providing for each other. It was called Don't Talk to Me. And every day we'd have a coffee at the same time on, you know, whatever, on WhatsApp or FaceTime or whatever. And each day it would be one of our turn to host in a cafe. You know, you'd host the cafe and you'd give the cafe a name and stuff. And so everyone was finding ways basically to get through and maintain social connection and not like lose their minds and kill their families. And I was trying to think of a show or something I could do, you know, that was something I instinctively loved, and also that would, wow, I could recast the memory entirely because I don't remember the particulars. Truth be told, Duncan, I was stoned and alone, and I was trying to think of something to do. And so I started being like, well, I could have a spelling bee, because in spelling bees, you know, like there's a lot of opportunity for comedy in spelling, because in a spelling bee, and like the Scripps National Spelling Bee, you can ask for a language of origin, a definition, and to hear the word in a sentence. And, you know,
every one of those is a moment.
There's 3 joke opportunities off of the word. And so I thought, okay, what I'll do is I get some people from Snort. So Snort, we're having occasional catch-ups on Zoom. And I said to some friends in Snort, I said, hey, I would love to host a spelling bee with some of you guys. We'll just get together and I'll host a spelling bee and we'll go through it. And so I did that. And then I did it again and sort of tweaked it and refined it a little bit. And then I thought, I could put this on YouTube. I don't know who's going to watch it, but I could host one of these on YouTube and see if people watch it. And it was quite a nice thing to anchor my week around. It gave me some sense of, I don't want to say purpose, but it did fill a day.
There was just a kind of everything. There was no weekends. It was just this big blob.
And there was also inside of, the most ambitious part of my brain was like, there was a scale inside of it. I never thought about it beyond, I thought we might just all be inside forever. But I was like, everyone around the world is inside. And I've got friends who are comedians in New York. I've got friends who are comedians in Los Angeles, in London, in Toronto. I've got friends who are comedians in Mumbai, and Australia and here. And I had this vision where I was like, no, there's no show, either pre-pandemic, during the pandemic, or podcast that is truly global, that pulls together that curates this lineup of phenomenal, like the funniest comedian from the UK alongside someone who you think would be complimentary from America, from Australia and New Zealand. And so I had this long-term, or not inside of the pandemic, this long-term vision of being like, I have connections. I'm friends.
Like an Olympics of comedy kind of.
And I'm friends with enough of these people that I could, and all of them are at home doing nothing. All of them would be grateful for the chance to hang out, be funny, meet a new person, and also have some sort of performance element. Not every comedian missed that, but so that was the vision. I started off doing it with New Zealand comics, my friends who are here, and then started folding in Australian comics because in terms of time difference, that was easier. And then started reaching out as far as like American comics, and had started booking as far ahead as getting like UK comics, and sort of was starting to do this. And then I think I made 6 of them, and George Floyd got murdered in America, and then the Black Lives Matter movement exploded, and it suddenly felt very odd. I don't know if you remember how like centralized, sort of the diaspora of like pop culture and cultural conversation now is so far reaching, but I don't know if you remember at that period, it was like we were all on one thing. And so all of a sudden it felt very uncomfortable and sort of wrong for me to be like, inside of this massive social justice movement and protest, for me to be like, and would anyone like to watch me get these comedians to spell some words? And so
absolutely.
I stopped doing it, and but it was fun. And then I think at the end of that year, New Zealand had a very unusual lockdown cycle, but we were out of lockdown. I thought, do you know what? That's actually a really cool idea. I'm going to mount that as a live show. So I did 5 nights or something in a row at the basement studio. And the idea was that I'd do 4 nights, and the winner of each night would then compete on the final night. We'd have like a grand final. But because of availability or whatever, how it worked out, it didn't work. It was just 5 different nights of spelling. And so then I thought, okay, this is either a podcast or a TV show, but this has legs that are greater than just being this live show.
Because it's quite interesting, right? Because in my mind, looking at where it is now and sort of starting to imagine what it might be, it has to be the product of, a lot of ideation, a lot of thinking about how it scales, how it translates into different mediums. But what you're saying is it is just stoned lonely lockdown.
Yes, at its start, but doing it and how much fun I had doing it and the way people responded to it. And also, I've talked to my therapist over the last year a lot about, I have a very poor perception of my own work ethic and self-discipline.
Well, you think you underrate it?
I constantly think I have very poor work ethic and I'm lazy. And to an extent, I still believe that to be true, even though I'm being coached out of saying that about myself. But there is inside of all of it, I think it's because I don't ascribe the same value to the work I do that I enjoy to the idea of like grinding through something that is hard.
Yeah. But also, I mean, if you look at, My Mind is Blowing Me Crazy, there's large chunks of that which required you wandering around the city stoned, just kind of being bored effectively. And you can't just force that. Like it has to have a certain looseness to it.
Yeah. And it's sort of, it's acknowledging, I think it's beyond my own belief that deliberately being bored or, living the life I do.
It's a very hard thing to explain to your parents.
It is a very hard thing to explain to my parents. But now that they see, Mum and Dad came to a recording of the Spelling Bee TV show. They weren't going to. I was like, I think you'll like it. And they were like, oh, no, we'll see it on TV. And then my little sister, Annie, was like, I think outside of the family thread or my communication with them was like, hey, this is like, this is a pretty big deal for Guy. I think it would be nice if you came up and checked it out. And so they came up and they watched the records. And it was like, there was pride emanating from their very body. It was the most excited and prideful I've seen them, in a way that was so, it made me quite emotional because they like that I do stand up and they like that I'm following my dream, but it is unusual to them. And also I think, they paid for a private education. So I think maybe it's that it looks like they're actually getting return on investment by me pulling apart words. They're like, yes, it was worth it.
My man can spell.
Yeah.
So beyond all that, which is lovely.
Yeah.
There's also the thing that struck me, like immediately on watching it and knowing a little bit of how the television industry worked was like, oh, this is IP, and that, I'm assuming that Alex Horn lives quite well.
Yes.
And, at what point do you start to think, actually, this is a fun thing to do. This is a good live show. This might even be a New Zealand TV show, to that next layer of this thing can be bundled, and that original idea of the Olympics of comedy could, my shorthand, could really be a thing.
Well, so I was lucky enough to do Taskmaster New Zealand, and I was already a Taskmaster fan. And in terms of looking at panel shows, inside of New Zealand, what the magic of Taskmaster and I think that what makes it such a juggernaut is that it's timeless, is that someone can discover Taskmaster at any point. They could go back to the very beginning, watch a season from 10 years ago and fall in love with it in a way that is impossible for any topical panel show. Like, you cannot go back. You're not going to go, unless you're sort of, doing it ironically or as some weird research project, or you're a total diehard. You can't go back and watch 7 days episodes from 10 years ago.
Yeah, see, like, Iraq war jokes.
Exactly. And so, the idea of it existing in a vacuum, and I've always thought that with stand-up comedy as well, which is something I sort of semi-lifted from Norm Macdonald, which is like his material is non-topical. All of it's meant to be able to exist in a vacuum. Like a true timeless joke is something that can be funny 50 years from now. And so if your jokes are all responsive, you can really capture the zeitgeist and build a huge audience that way and whatever, but the value diminishes over time. And so I've always been obsessed by that idea. Taskmaster fulfills that brief. With Spelling Bee, I thought words are timeless. It's a universal access point. Everyone has a connection, and it means that people can watch these. These can be like historical, not artifacts, but like someone can watch. All of those original Spelling Bees are still on my YouTube channel. I get people messaging me about them all the time, being like, this should be a TV show. And I'm like, well, you got no idea. Keep watching. And so I don't know when exactly it happened, but doing Taskmaster, that was the best working experience outside of doing stand-up in my life. And I sort of thought, I tried to basically gamify spelling and push a Spelling Bee through the Taskmaster format or concept. And it's hard to say when exactly the idea that it was IP or it was something that could be much greater than just this little thing I'm doing dawned on me. I think it was over time, the more I was finessing it and the more, and this goes back to the work ethic thing, but I think it's when I have a natural inclination to work on something, I don't think it's work, even though obviously it is. And over all of that time, I was like, this is actually, when I was trying to get it mounted as a TV show here in New Zealand, I was pretty like, when I got pushed back very gently a few times, and I was like, how can you not see? Like, I've got something here. I've got something that you should really want here. And this doesn't have to be limited to New Zealand or one set. Like, this is.
Well, even down to like the staging and there's a whole bunch of elements to it that feel like you can port them to give it a very distinctive identity.
And I was very lucky in that I got to have a huge amount of creative. I was the showrunner of it, so I got a huge amount of creative input and control over the way it looks. And even the way it looks, I think, and this isn't to criticize anything. This is just I was very fortunate to get to build something in my vision. I think a lot of panel shows and a lot of current affairs TV have a very, I don't know if modern is the right word for the aesthetic, but there's a certain aesthetic that they all abide, which is...
they're often shot in the same studios.
Yeah.
And so you really have a relatively limited ability to actually impose any kind of visual language.
It's very right now. And I don't think time is going to be kind to the current prevailing aesthetic. And so I thought, well, you know, if I want this show to exist in a vacuum, if I pull an aesthetic from the past and also update it in certain ways... And like, it was a very conscious choice that it wasn't going to be done on screens. Like all of the props are material and physical, because I think I want someone to find this show in 20 years and be like, when was that made?
Well, it also means it's recognized, like if it's like a TikTok of it, it's going to be, you're going to very quickly go, okay, that's that thing.
Yeah.
You know?
And again, that's something that Taskmaster has. And, you know, all of these... I never actively sat down and looked at the sort of mountain of decisions or creative, you know, like creative decisions, I guess, that would have to be made to qualify all of this. But like sort of magpieing ideas and pulling all of this stuff together in disparate conversations and moments, and then, you know, pushing it all together in the middle with a phenomenal team around me who I'm so grateful for. You know, what is most staggering to me about Spelling Bee is... how small the gap is between the exact show I dreamt of making and the show that we made. It's like a percentage point. And that's crazy because this is a prime time, like mainstream. It goes out at 7:30 on Thursdays on TV3. It's for everyone.
Yeah.
Like you're meant to be able to watch it with your 11-year-old. And I've had 11-year-olds come to a comedy show in every single city I've done this year.
Because of Spelling Bee.
Yeah.
So where to from here? Like, are you, I don't know to what extent you can reveal this, but, you know, are you actively shopping this in overseas markets? And would you go with it? Like, or what's the, you know, how much can you retain that level of control while also becoming an exporter?
It's interesting and new terrain for me. I've got no idea. I would love to talk to Alex Horn about how he did it with Taskmaster. My dream, of course, would be to like the next logical stepping point in terms of trying to develop the format overseas would be taking it to Australia. And I think I am now enough of a known entity to Australian broadcasters and audiences that I would be able to host it over there. So that feels like a very clean sort of logical progression. Beyond that, you know, I think it would make a lot of sense. And it was made, you know, like modeled on certain parts of British comedy. And
you can see they've been making shows in that genre. Like I remember watching them as a kid growing up in the early 90s kind of thing.
I mean, I would love to do that as well. But again, it's like my primary ambition is to be funny. And the amount of like back rubbing and political conversation it probably requires to facilitate this thing moving forward is not inside of my wheelhouse or specific sphere of interest. And so I have, you know, the Kevin & Co, the production company, and also Beck facilitate, they have relationships with people, and I sort of have belief in them and hope for the best. I am certainly not... the main way I'm driving the idea of this show working in these places, I've taken it to... I did like 5 in Melbourne in a 350-seat room this year, and they were absolutely electric. Like, it was crazy. And I was getting the best comedians who were in the festival to come and do them.
Did you have people in the audience?
Yeah, and there are producers and networks are coming to watch those. And so the way I see my responsibility inside of this is like... show them an undeniable product and make them want it.
On that.
And that's the stuff that's inside of my control, you know. And that's a big one. That's across all the facets of my career. Has always been, because it's inevitably you don't get things you want, and you don't get opportunities you think you might be owed at certain points, and it's like all you can reduce it to is like, well, okay, how funny can I be? Like, you know, all you can do, you can spend that. It's a very boring truism that don't get bitter, get better. But like, you can spend all of this energy being frustrated and venting or whatever. But it's like, well, what if I became so funny it was literally impossible for someone not to say yes?
Not to book you.
Yeah.
So we're conscious that you've got we've both got dueling outs here.
I think mine was
just a little
mine
bit
was a minute before yours from what you said, I think.
Yeah, that's just from memory. But I want to talk just before we do go about two things, but one of which has ended, and another of which you sort of have talked about kind of feeling like you have left behind or outgrown, overgrown somehow, which is Snort and The Basement, both of which had enormous roles in being sort of venues, institutions that kind of allowed you to grow as a comic.
Yeah, I mean, Snort, which is an improvised comedy show that was started 10 years ago with a lot of my generation of comedians, and its home was The Basement. So yeah, that was Donna Brookbanks, Eli Mathewson, and Eddie Dever basically started Snort from Christchurch, having been part of the Scared Scriptless with the Court Jesters they saw, and we were all pretty young with a lot of time on our hands and still very ambitious. Not to say that ambition's dimmed, but to give away every Friday night of a year was not the same sort of trade that it is now. And so the initial run was meant to be 4 weeks through September, and all the shows were full, and it was really fun. And there was a certain alchemy or natural chemistry that formed. And I think, I don't know if Snort asked or if The Basement extended an offer for it to keep going. And so it sort of just like turbocharged a lot of our creative relationships with each other, and also, formed this umbrella under which we could all, as a group, introduce ourselves, but individually inside of that group, introduce ourselves to audiences.
And you're just working out, like you're going to get funnier by just
doing it over and over again.
And over, forever.
Yeah. And so at the same time, Snort started in, I think it must have been 2014, which is the same year I did my first solo show. It was the year after I'd come back to New Zealand, I think at the end of 2013, after I spent a year doing stand-up comedy in Canada. And so I'd come back and I thought I was good, but I still couldn't get gigs really. And all of this stuff was sort of happening simultaneously, and it just propelled. And so the first show I did was actually that year that you came, was at the Basement Theatre, and so I felt comfortable there because that was a performance space I'd spent a lot of time, in, and felt, rightly or wrongly, perhaps a sense of ownership of, or at least creative kinship to. And so I did my first show there. The next year, actually, I was still doing Snort all the time, but I did my show at Monte Cristo, which was a venue I ran with, Jesse Griffin was sort of the creative spearhead, but it was with Jesse, Tim Batt, Brendan Green, and myself. I was very much fourth fiddle in that group, but for 2 years set up this sort of independent venue during the comedy festival, which was amazing, and probably a whole different conversation that you should have with Jesse, because he's got a great brain, and sort of, he's also... Wilson Dixon is like one of the funniest comedy creations ever in New Zealand. Him and Jackie are just a powerhouse together. Jackie Van Beek's his wife. But that's by the by. And so, over the years, sort of developing my voice and feeling very at home and welcome. And like the Basement was then reaching out, and there were stand-up comedy nights running in the studio on Friday. And it felt like a real hotbed for not just the people inside of Snort, but also by extension, other people who weren't part of Snort, or who were, half a generation behind us comedically, to come through and form their voices. And it was, it was amazing. It felt like a real creative home. And as it grew or whatever, it's hard to pinpoint, when things change, but at some point, you get older. I guess it's every day, but we traditionally demark by every year. And it's like it became harder for the people who were originally all doing the shows together to all be able to do the shows. And also, when we started, Snort was almost in a different cultural climate. Like, it was predominantly a bunch of white improvisers and comedians, and we sort of started to reckon with that as we grew, and so the cast grew.
The fact of it happening weekly while the culture is moving, you've got this thing that's solid, and having to respond to a culture which changed dramatically through that time is really fascinating.
And like, we brought in Julie Zhu, who's still our fantastic producer, who's also and helped grow the company and move it forward. And it just, every year we wound up having these meetings where we were saying like, well, what's the future of Snort and what do we want to do? And we never blooded it into a full-blown business. We didn't start like teaching improv underneath the banner of Snort the way that they did with UCB in America or whatever. And it sort of just became, I mean, it's still going and it's still amazing. And it's still sold out every Friday. You can go to the basement still and you can go and see Snort. But at some point during all of this, my own relationship to it was something I didn't want to be driving or spearheading, or like, I still wanted to, basically I wanted everything I wanted and to not have to do anything I didn't want to do. So I just wanted to be able to show up when I was available and do the show.
Yeah, you're like a bench player rather than a starter at this point.
Exactly. And it's sort of, it's a hard thing to articulate, but at a certain point it felt like, even though we're still developing and growing new improvisers and there's this phenomenal new wave of comedic and improv talent coming through, it didn't feel like we were creating anything new or challenging ourselves or pushing it forward. And so it's a bit of a, piss or get off the pot or whatever the turn of phrase is, where it's like, if Snort just continues to occupy that 10 p.m. space in the basement every Friday, it's blocking generations of talent and the necessary new voices. And so 10 years is a very beautiful moment to demarcate and say, look at what we built, and for all of us to be able to move on. And inside of that, as I've grown older as well, and I guess my comedic homes have moved around and become more, transient, the basement has developed as it doesn't feel to me, and I'm probably wrong, but like a comedic home the way it did. It feels like it's more of a developmental theatre space. There was a period where I felt like I was right in the middle of the zeitgeist of what was happening at the basement, and I don't know if it's comedically or culturally or the fact I'm just old now, but it's I still love performing there and I love watching shows there, but it feels like a nostalgia kick when I go back there, less than the place I go where I know I'm going to run into a friend and we can have a beer. It's I think I'm describing aging. I
think you are, but and growing. It's no, look, honestly, it's been a really cool conversation, and I think that, like, I just really like the way that you sort of have approached your career and kind of and observe the sort of that tension between having to kind of forge a path, but also try and maintain that kind of artistic core and view it as a positive, that tension, rather than being kind of defeated or frustrated by it.
Yeah.
So anyway, I think I've got to get to something. So
yeah. Oh shit! Is that the time? Oh, Duncan, I'm so sorry. I have to leave like right now.
Thanks so much for coming up, Guy. It's been awesome. That was The Fold, brought to you by our partners at oOh!media, an ASX-listed communications giant with over 800 staff and thousands of sites. It partners with advertisers, leaseholders, community organisations and governments to efficiently reach large and diverse audiences. Huge thanks to oOh!media for sponsoring this episode of The Fold.